Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. There has been consensus by historians and the media that Putin's war for Ukraine doesn't make sense, or that he didn't get the politics of Ukraine right, or that it was a strategic blunder. Then the conversation went over to Putin's state of mind, that he's unhinged, irrational. All of these assertions are wrong. In the words of the Emperor, the arch-villain from Star Wars, Putin may instead be saying,
"Excellent. Everything is going as planned."
Now let's deal with 5 reasons why Putin's war makes sense right now. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, number 1, it's not about tanks, it's about banks. Have you heard that before? Well, it's both, isn't it? But if this was a war about money and only money, sanctions would have had an effect. The war for Ukraine is really motivated by a combination of factors: territory, money, and also prestige. Ukraine was a jewel in the former Russian crown, and without Kiev as it's now known, the Russian crown has lost some of its shimmer. Specifically, what does that mean? Ukraine doesn't really have oil reserves. It imports 90% of its oil and natural gas from Russia. Even so, it has an elaborate piping infrastructure, allowing it to place toll gates on Russian gas moving through its territory. In other words, Ukraine benefits at Russia's expense. So if you feel intimately connected to Russia's diminishing empire, this is only adding insult to injury. If Ukraine doesn't have much in the way of mineral resources, it does have decent manufacturing industries, specifically in shipbuilding, automotives, aircraft, and aerospace. Once upon a time, the Ukraine was the industrial base of the Soviet Union, and today it remains the breadbasket of Europe. The country is the 3rd largest producer in the world of potatoes, behind China and India, the 5th largest producer of maize and carrots, the 8th largest producer of wheat, and the 11th largest producer of apples in the world. But the country also blocks Russia's access into Europe, not only in terms of land access, but also into the Black Sea, which is connected to the busy Mediterranean via the Bosporus Strait, where Turkey's capital Istanbul is located. As long ago as 8 years ago, Simon Schama appeared on Channel 4 News and spoke about Russia's psychological kinship with Germany in the 1930s. He described it as a humiliated empire, as an empire that had lost territory and prestige.
The experience with Germany was that there was an ex-empire that felt itself to be humiliated, deprived of territories that had long been German. The mass psychology of vindication on the street is what's all about Vladimir. It accounts for Vladimir Putin's incredible popularity.
In other words, Putin has been riding the coattails of a generalized feeling of disenfranchisement felt by the average Russian. In other words, Russia has been supporting a leader promising to make Russia great again.
Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen.
Number 2, recent popular uprisings west of Russia have made it worse. The context for Schama going on the news and talking about Russia in these terms in March 2014 was the war for Crimea. No, not the 3-year Crimean War which Russia lost to an allied force that included France, Britain and other countries between 1853 and 1856. The annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation happened between February and March 2014, 8 not so long years ago. Ukraine's response was to limit the supplies of fresh water to Crimea, which led to crop failures in Crimea. Those freshwater supplies were recently restored following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine also refused to allow its own citizens to enter or trade with Crimea, essentially forming a blockade and cutting it off. Following the annexation, we saw activists begin organizing flash mobs in supermarkets to urge customers not to buy Russian goods. That was in March 2014, as well as to boycott Russian gas stations, banks, and concerts. In April 2014, some cinemas in Kyiv, Lviv, and Odessa began shunning Russian films. On March 15, 30,000 people protested in Moscow the day before the Crimean referendum. So if you felt injured by Russia's diminishing legacy, Ukraine felt like it was becoming a bigger and nastier thorn, causing that wound to fester. And rather than underestimating or ignoring Ukraine's resolve against Russia, Putin was well aware of it, which is why he wants to destroy it. The lesson Russia learned from the annexation of Crimea was that it could do what it did, at least militarily, with impunity, and the West, doing its worst, could only slap a few sanctions on them. It also learned that the pushback from Ukraine threatened to set off more popular uprisings against Russia, not only in Ukraine, not only in other former Russian territories, but in Russia itself. But perhaps the biggest issue was that Ukraine's response to Russia's annexation of Crimea in early 2014, as well as its aggression in Ukraine, was that by August of the same year, Ukraine began seeking NATO membership. By July 2015, a poll found almost 2/3 of the Ukrainian government supported NATO membership. By late 2018, NATO membership had become a key goal and the main foreign policy objective. And if Putin was in the habit of crushing dissent, why not crush the greatest dissenter, the greatest source of opprobrium, the greatest threat, Ukraine? If you look right at the top of the map above Belarus, which is pro-Russian but has seen popular uprisings against Russia, we see Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They have effectively closed Russia off from most of the northern European coastline. Probably the coastline they do have access to is frozen for a significant portion of the year. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification, a wall of former Russian states has joined NATO, effectively pushing Russia relentlessly eastwards and naturally pushing Russia east, meaning the West was expanding at Russia's expense. Remember, Russia is a single, very large country holding out against the West, whereas the West is an almost global agglomeration of alliances. If you were Russia, you would definitely feel impinged on all sides. So Russia is chasing a fairy tale of former glory, trying to regain its status, only to find itself in a nightmare where the more they pursue the fairy tale, the more pushback there seems to be. That brings us to the third point, Netflix. In March 2014, a satirical article was published in The New Yorker announcing that the US were freezing Putin's personal Netflix account. I suppose this was to illustrate the slap-of-the-wrist response the US had made then to the invasion of Crimea. But a few years later, a number of documentaries about Putin and Ukraine steadily came streaming out, including on Netflix. There was Alexandra, 2007, about anti-war sentiment coexisting within a militaristic regime. Leviathan, 2014, throwing stones at the Kafka-like hellscape of corruption and repression that is Putin's Russia. Winter on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom, in 2015. Maiden, 2015, themes of revolution on Kyiv's Independence Square. Donbass, 2019, backdrop by the civil war between Ukrainian nationalists and Russia's proxy People's Republic in the east of the country. For Schama, also 2019, Aleppo in Syria becomes a dusty maelstrom as it comes under siege from Assad's forces and gets pulverized by Putin's Russian bombers. According to one source, it captures the raw courage of Aleppo citizens as they cling on under fire and the sheer callousness of Russian airstrikes on hospitals. Civilians were considered fair game then. And Citizen K, also 2019, about Russian oligarchs. As recently as a week ago, on March 1st, it was announced that Netflix in Russia would be used to broadcast Putin propaganda, only for Netflix to pull the plug on Russia entirely in a bizarre fulfillment to Andy Borowitz's satirical prophecy in The New Yorker a few years earlier. All of the aforementioned films and documentaries are besides the documentaries on Putin himself, including the Oliver Stone series and Putin, a Russian spy story. Do you think Putin himself would have taken an interest in documentaries about him? And afterwards, would he venture to similar fare, such as Russia's glory days where their power and might expanded, such as during World War II, in color? If you've watched the series on Netflix, you'll know all the ways it may have inspired Putin. Sometimes a war helps to create new heroes, or elevates fallen ones back to their rightful place. Well, isn't that what he was thinking? Number 4, Messianic figure. It is possible the religious aspect to this story is underestimated because we traditionally think of the Russians as irreligious. Today, 70% of Russians consider themselves as Orthodox Christians. Does Putin regard himself as a Messianic figure? It's been suggested. I'm of the view that he may want to present himself as such, that he may want to use this image of being a Russian icon, similar to the iconography of the past, Lenin, Stalin. I think a conservative, religious, nationalist view tends to be self-reinforcing, but it can become dangerous, and this seems to be the Russian version of that. Putin may see himself as not necessarily the savior of Russia, but rather Russia's hammer, a hammer that has fallen into disuse and lost its chromy metallic shine. He is there to restore Russia to its rightful place. And with that, I think, is Putin's desire to restore himself to whatever he considers his rightful place. For a long time, Putin was an invisible man, a spy. He also lost his wife, Lyudmila, a linguist, to divorce in June 2013. Crimea was invaded just a few months later. I think Putin's world falling apart and the feeling of Russia falling apart, and his feeling isolated during the pandemic, and Russia becoming more isolated, and Putin plunging Russia into war are all related. And that brings us to the 5th and final point, self-preservation. So Putin's feelings of self-preservation are tied, I believe, to his projections of Russia's self needing preservation. In 2015, Putin said, "When a fight is inevitable, you hit first." A fight may not have seemed inevitable to us because we don't care about Russia's failing aspirations to greatness. But there's a simple way to care about that. How have you felt about America losing its prestige? Now, imagine if America was steadily losing territory to both Mexico and Canada. And imagine if Mexico and Canada were part of a huge and powerful alliance of much bigger and more powerful nations. And just as Putin wants to get his mojo back after his divorce, he is rumored to be in a relationship with a former Olympic rhythmic gymnast and Russian MP. He also wants to give Russia back its mojo. It must feel like he's succeeding. Everyone is talking about him, and once again the world, if not Ukraine, fears Russia.